One of the greatest evils of the modern era was the Nazi Holocaust of the 1940s. 9 million people were murdered, 6 million of them because they were Jewish, others because they were Roma, or because they were communists, or because they were gay. John Lennox, professor of mathematics at Oxford, tells a story about touring Eastern Europe and meeting a Jewish woman from South Africa. The woman told Lennox that she was researching how her relatives had perished during the Holocaust. And at one point on their guided tour, they passed a display that had the following words written on it: Arbeit macht frei, or work makes free. It was a mock-up of the main gate to the Nazi death camp at Auschwitz. The display also had pictures of the horrific medical experiments carried out on young children by the infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele. And at that point on the tour, the Jewish woman turned to Lennox and asked, "And what does your religion make of this?" Lennox writes, "What was I to say? She had lost her parents and many relatives in the Holocaust. I could scarcely bear to look at the Mengele photographs because of the sheer horror of imagining my own children suffering such a fate. I had nothing in my life that remotely paralleled the horror that her family had endured." The question of suffering is not an academic question. It's not an apologetic or logical question, but it is far more personal. Some of you have known tears that few others have experienced. You know the shame. You know the unanswered questions, the cries of anguish. You've got all the normal griefs of this life, the tearful farewells, the diseases, the health conditions, the isolation, the loneliness. You know the difficulties of being married and the heartbreak that often follows trying to build a family together. And as we look at the Gospel according to Mark, understand that it was written to Christians who had suffered all the normal sufferings of this life, but who did so at a time and in an era in which only half of children lived to adulthood. Could you imagine losing half of your children? On top of that, these early Christians faced great persecution, not just from governments, but from their own families, from whole communities. They were a people who were acquainted with grief, and they suffered terribly. All the sufferings of this life, but on top of all that, persecution. The early Christians who read this gospel would have felt great pressure to defend their faith, if not to abandon it. If defending it, the pressure would mount to make Christianity look really good, to make it look really respectable and really competent. And no one faced these threats more than the early Christian leaders, because it was the leaders more than anyone else who were pinpointed as the objects of the harshest reprisals from the Roman government. From a worldly perspective, you might expect that early Christian leaders would want to look competent, that they would want to look respectable in order to maintain their influence over the church and to hold back persecution on account of their religion. They would face exceptional pressures. They would be singled out for arrest and abuse. In all of that, you can imagine how some might even feel abandoned by God. What kind of leaders would be shaped with such intense suffering? You'd have to wonder, does God even love me? Does he care? We read an account today that was recorded in all three of the synoptic gospels. It was something that was so essential and so important that God gave it to us 3 times. We read this account of the suffering of Jesus in a garden called Gethsemane, the sufferings of a leader as recounted to us by the leaders of the church he founded. And what we see here makes no sense from a worldly perspective. Even if it all happened as it says, which it did, it makes no sense that the early Christian leaders would tell anyone about it, because what we're going to read would have been, from a Roman perspective, some very compromising and very embarrassing information. What's going on here? We're going to start by reading the 14th chapter of the Gospel according to St. Mark, beginning in the 32nd verse. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took Peter, James, and John along with him, and he began to be deeply distressed and troubled. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death," he said to them. "Stay here and keep watch." Going a little further, he fell to the ground and prayed that if possible the hour might pass from him. "Abba, Father," he said, "everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will." Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Simon," he said to Peter, "are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak." Once more he went away and prayed the same thing. When he came back, he again found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy and they didn't know what to say to him. Returning a third time, he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Enough, the hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." What do we see here? We see what would have been, for early Christian leaders in a Roman context, an embarrassing account that many would hold against them. Why include an embarrassing account about Jesus and about the Christian leaders who can't even stay awake? Jesus is presented here as weak, perhaps vacillating, definitely needy. All along, Jesus has been saying that he came to die, and now he seems less certain about that. He says, "My soul is overwhelmed." Such strong language, overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. "Abba, Father, take this cup from me." Notice how this contrasts with what we read about Jesus elsewhere in this gospel. This is the same Jesus who, in power and strength, drove out the money changers from the temple courts. The Jesus who would speak a few words and raise the dead. Jesus who could flatten all the kinetic energy within a heaving sea simply by speaking a word. Jesus who could restore sight to the blind and make the lame to walk. This was the Jesus who preached and left people amazed at his authority. Most of all, this was the Jesus who was always there for everybody else, who never asked anyone for anything, but had forgiven sin, given compassion to those who were hurting, was tender with those caught in sin, and brought deliverance to those who were in bondage. And then you look at Jesus in Gethsemane, and it's different. Having brought so much blessing to so many people, for the very first time we see Jesus having needs, real, deep, emotional needs. We read Jesus began to be deeply distressed and troubled. Jesus needs somebody at his side because he's not sure he can face what he has to face alone. And the man who was there for everyone else when his hour of need comes is alone. His followers can't even stay awake for him. He's abandoned in his weakness. Look at what we see here. Certainly he's physically weak, and that continues all the way up to the cross. But more so, he's emotionally weak. He says, "I am in anguish." Most folks don't want to follow leaders who are in anguish. Hey, let's go find a movement to join that has anguished leadership. I want to hitch my car to an anguished engine. And it seems like a dark cloud has settled about Jesus in Gethsemane. There's no sense of hope here for Jesus. This cup he has to drink seems to preoccupy him. He's asking the Father to change his mind if it's his will. He says he doesn't want to do what they had always planned, what previously in Mark's gospel Jesus seems so determined to do. He's checking with the Father to see if there's a way out. And when he didn't get the answer he wanted, he went back a second time. And when he still didn't get an answer that he wanted, he went back a third time. Once more, we read, he went away and prayed the same thing. This sort of thing does not build confidence in leadership. It would have been embarrassing to many early Christians. Jesus says, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death." Overwhelmed. Jesus, overwhelmed, as in, this is more than I can handle. It's a cloud of darkness and perhaps despair. Jesus despairing in prayer. Everywhere else you see Jesus delighting in prayer, communing with the Father and coming out of that with joy and hope and strength and delight. And so what's going on here? What has changed? Jesus was facing being rejected by God the Father. That's why he, for the first time, needed the comfort of an angel, the comfort of his friends. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of losing the Father. He was experiencing losing the Father's favor. Jesus was already beginning to take up our sin. The Father was already turning his back on his Son. Jesus was feeling abandoned because he had been abandoned by his disciples, or would be, and he would be abandoned by the Father. Next, he would be on the cross saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which in Aramaic means, my God, why have you forsaken me? Put yourself in the shoes of the earliest Christians as they faced a hostile world. This account would be greatly damaging to the new religion's image. By the time Mark published this account, they were already facing the very temptation Jesus was warning them about. Here in this account of Gethsemane, Jesus is warning them and us to watch and pray so that you will not fall into temptation, the temptation to abandon Jesus. Compare this to the Roman ideal of firmitas, or tenacity, or strength of mind. The great leader, according to the Romans, doesn't waver. He doesn't show weakness. He doesn't second-guess himself, but he's driven, firm, and unshakable. Like the Roman general Lucius, who has authorized the brutal sacking of 70 towns in the kingdom of Epirus and enslaved 150,000 people, and on his return to Rome was celebrated with huge triumphs in which the Senate awarded him the title Macedonicus. That's a hero. That's a great leader. Firm, tenacious, strength of mind, never second-guessing, never waver, never show weakness, unshakable. And here we see Jesus shakeable. Here we see Jesus weak, emotionally troubled, second-guessing and looking to see if there's another way to accomplish what he and the Father have set out to accomplish. And realize how this passage was quoted by pagan polemicists in attacking Christianity. Indeed, when the pagan Celsus, Greek would have been Kelsos, but we've adopted the Italian pronunciation, for lack of a better term. Italians have had a heavy influence on the history of Western Christendom. So we'll say Celsus. In the late 2nd century, pagan apologist, he wrote the earliest known treatise against the Christian faith. And in the treatise, one of his main arguments was quoting this specific passage. Celsus asks, why does he shriek and lament and pray to escape the fear of destruction, speaking thus, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. Celsus sees Jesus as inconsistent, as cowardly, as weak, a messenger that hides away in a garden, blubbering in weakness rather than proclaiming the message he was given. Jesus' depiction in Gethsemane was seen as cowardly. He was seen as without honor. He looked shameful to a Roman, disgraceful even. And this wasn't the only embarrassing content in the gospel. When Jesus then dies by crucifixion, it was a death that was considered so humiliating that it must not be mentioned in polite company. And then at the resurrection, the first witnesses are all women, and women were not treated as considered reliable witnesses in a court of law in Judaism or in the empire. Why would the early Christians have recorded these embarrassing things? These records would only hurt their credibility for centuries before their pagan and Jewish audience, making their chief leader, Jesus, look really bad, really sub-Roman. The gospel writers make all sorts of editorial decisions about what they're going to include and what they're not going to include in order to communicate the gospel to the people that they're writing to. Why could they have not just cut this part out and thrown it away? But instead, not only did they include it 3 times. Why not just throw in an I am discourse? Instead, the only way the early Christians would have allowed this account to be written down is if it was all absolutely true and factual, and if they considered it absolutely essential to our salvation. If it actually happened this way, and if their priority was to give full disclosure, if they felt burdened to write down exactly what happened, it's the only way it makes sense. Were the early Christians going to make something up, they'd have made up something that actually advances their cause instead of hindering it, humanly speaking. And this account was embarrassing for the early church's leaders, too, for the apostles. What's going on? The disciples look really bad here. Simon, are you asleep? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? That's not going to play well. Peter was chief among the apostles. In the book of Acts, he was the main spokesperson for the apostles. And here, in sacred scripture, in the very gospel accounts, he's being shown to be unreliable. He wasn't there for Jesus when Jesus needed him. The ruling theory about how religious texts come about is that religious texts are sponsored by religious leaders, and their purpose is to bolster the power and the influence of the religious leadership within a religious movement. That's not what's happening here. This is doing just the opposite. This account shows Peter, James, and John abandoning Jesus in their time of need. That's not going to bump up their credibility with the Christians for very long. That's making them look dishonorable and weak. They value their sleep too much. There was one thing Jesus asked of them, only one thing, and it's the one thing they did not do 3 times over. Just before this passage, in verse 27 to 31, Jesus had told Peter that he would deny him 3 times. All the disciples eventually abandon Jesus and flee. Looking at the job description of an apostle, of a leader, you really can't get much less competent than these men. And it's not the only time we see these sorts of things about the apostles. We read Peter constantly putting his foot in his mouth. Jesus at one point called Peter Satan. How many of you would still be here if Jesus called Greg Johnson Satan? It doesn't help. It doesn't help. The PR is bad. The optics are not good. It's just, Jesus called his apostles oligopistoi, which means little faith one, so you of little faith. He asks, are you still unbelieving? Implied answer, well, yeah, sure. Check that box, still unbelieving. The gospel accounts are littered with unflattering references to the apostles who went on to lead the church. So what's going on? This is the gospel according to Mark, which historically we know to have been Peter's gospel. Mark was Peter's sidekick. And so nothing could have been included in the gospel according to Mark unless Peter signed off on it. Of that, you can be absolutely sure. But by the time this gospel was written, Peter no longer felt the need to look competent. He no longer felt a need to look strong. And the same with the other apostles. They could have shaped the message and the gospels in such a way to make them look competent, but they no longer needed to feel competent. Why not? They wanted people to know that they had been incompetent. What made them so free to own their failings in such a public way, in a way that might hinder their ministry? And what had changed is they had experienced Jesus. And as they grew to know Jesus, they lost their own need to pretend. They no longer needed to justify themselves. They no longer needed to measure up. They no longer needed to prove anything. Jesus had saved them. They were so weak and so bad that they needed saving and that they couldn't do it themselves. So they could be honest about being normal, marginally competent sinners who are loved by Christ, even as leaders. We all have within us this built-in drive to justify our own experience, to make our lives matter, to be someone, to not be a nobody, to not be a zero. And there are 1,001 ways that we try to justify ourselves. It could be through our career, it could be through our relationships, by building the perfect-looking family, by gaining great wealth or being immensely successful in our careers. It could come from, going viral on social media or looking really clever or having the perfect house or the perfect yard or the perfect physical appearance, the perfect body, the ideal clothes, all the degrees, and it's a never-ending performance treadmill that humans live on. And if you don't get off that performance treadmill, ultimately it devours and destroys you when you fail. And so what can get you off that treadmill? What got Peter off that treadmill? What got James and John off that treadmill? But that Jesus justified them, so they no longer needed to justify themselves. Jesus was good enough for them, so they no longer needed to be good enough. If he takes your sin and takes it on himself away from you so that you no longer bear it, then you can be honest, and you don't have to fake it till you make it. If you have Jesus' resume with your name on it, that's validation. And there's nothing you're going to do in this life that's going to, bump up that resume and make it a little embellished. Only the gospel can do this. And so these disciples no longer need to look competent. They no longer need to look powerful. I mean, earlier they were arguing about which of them gets to be at Jesus' right and left in the coming kingdom. Incredibly selfish. But now they're okay being weak, being human, being normal people who drop the ball sometimes, who weren't able to stand with Jesus in his hour of need because Jesus did something and it changed them. Jesus led them in a way that changed how they would lead others. They didn't have to be the strong leader. They didn't have to be competent. They could instead be self-forgetful and let their weakness highlight the glory and praise and strength of Jesus, because that's what the gospel does. By the time that St. Mark wrote this, these leaders were safe looking incompetent and weak because they knew Jesus was their competence and Jesus was their strength. It's the gospel cycle of full disclosure and complete acceptance, that the gospel, in the gospel, God sees us all the way down and still wants to be in relationship with us. He has full disclosure of everything that's wrong, and he's still committed. He still accepts us. So how did that happen? Okay. Well, I think first we need to understand what was happening in Gethsemane. We've talked before about the cup. Realize what the cup was. The cup was the cup of judgment, the cup of God's wrath. Isaiah 54, you will drink the cup of God's fury and you will stagger. Revelation speaks of it as the cup of God's wrath that is filled with the wine of his fury. And that's the cup that Jesus is talking about here. That's the cup he would drink, the cup of God's wrath. He'd drink it, and he'd drink it down because of God's fury against and opposition to all human cruelty, hate, betrayal, and sin, and Jesus would drink it all. This is the great exchange already starting, in which what Martin Luther called the great exchange, where I have all of my sin that I've spent half a century building up, and all of that is transferred to Jesus in Gethsemane, and he takes it to the cross and thereby drinks the cup of God's wrath, which is poured full strength into the cup of his fury. He drinks it down. And then Jesus, who is altogether righteous and worthy and always did what pleased the Father, all of his honor, all of his excellence, all of his righteousness is then transferred to you and to me when we believe, so that we're not only forgiven, we're clothed in the righteousness of God, an unremovable suit of perfection that leaves God smiling at us as he smiles on his Son, to whom we have been united by faith. The Father is saying to Jesus, you can have all these followers of yours, but there will be hell to pay. Hell is not necessarily fire and brimstone. Jesus uses very different analogies to describe it. Sometimes he describes it as Gehenna, which is the fires, was where they burned their trash and they were disintegrated. He uses it. He describes hell as outer darkness, which is a cold place, a place of exposure. Paul speaks of being shut out from the presence of God, being expelled, being rejected by the Father. But the Father was saying to Jesus, you can have all these followers of yours, but there will be hell to pay. The hell that I deserve for my own sin. And after asking 3 times if there was a different way, Jesus was saying, okay then, give me hell. Jesus drank the cup of God's wrath, which was filled with the wine of his fury. That's why Jesus is weeping in the garden. He's already losing his relationship with the Father, already feeling the coldness set in, already experiencing the outer darkness, already experiencing the burning. He is holding the cup of God's wrath. He's weighing his love for you, and then he's lifting that cup up to his lips and tilting it in. And as he went to the cross, he drank it. He drank it to the dregs. And if you believe in Jesus, there is not a drop of wrath left for you. He licked the cup dry and absorbed it all. One author and pastor says this. He says, "It was in the Garden of Gethsemane that I finally came to grips and made my peace, as it were, with the wrath of God." Now, it might shock some of you that a preaching minister was struggling with the very idea of a God of wrath, a God who sends people to hell. And then it was studying the Garden of Gethsemane when I finally came to peace with it, because I realized this. The reason why people get rid of the idea of hell and wrath is because they want a loving God. They say, I can't believe in hell and wrath because I want a more loving God. And I came to realize in the Garden of Gethsemane that if you get rid of the idea of hell and wrath, you actually have a less loving God. Because if there is no wrath by God on sin, and there's no such thing as hell, then not only does that make what happened to Jesus inexplicable, Jesus staggering the way he is, asking God, is there any other way, sweating blood. I mean, it means that he was wimpier than hundreds of his followers. If there was nothing like God's wrath. But the main thing is, if you don't believe in the wrath and hell, it trivializes what God has done. If you get rid of a God who has wrath and hell, you've got a God who loves us in general, but that's not as loving as the God of the Bible, the God of Jesus Christ, who loves us with a costly love. Look what it cost. Look what Jesus did. Look what he was taking. You get rid of wrath and hell, and he's not taking anything close to this. And therefore, what you've done is you've just turned his incredible act of love into just something very trivial and very small. And if the anticipation of these sufferings, if the very taste of these sufferings sent the Son of God into shock in Gethsemane, then what must it have been to drink them down to the bottom? This is why the early church leaders included Gethsemane in all three synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because this is the gospel. This is the only hope we have in the face of suffering and hardship and sorrow and persecution and death, that Jesus loved you and he drank the cup of God's wrath that was intended for you and me, and he drank it all the way down so that we would gain eternal life. It's the leader risking himself, sacrificing himself with a self-giving love to bless those who don't deserve it, like me. And that's what Jesus did for you. God's wrath and fury at our cruelty and rebellion were heading toward us, and Jesus intervened so that they would instead come upon him. He loved us when we were his enemies. He loved us at the cost of his own life, and so very much more. He took the full force of the blow, not as an impulse decision, but as something he had planned long before, a determination that would not flinch or waver, even as he wept in the garden as the Father turned his back on him so that he will never turn his back on you. Paul writes, at just the right time, when we were still powerless, Christ died for the ungodly. Very rarely will anyone die for a righteous person, though for a good person someone might possibly dare to die, but God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. What does that mean for you who believe? It means that of all the possible explanations that you have when you're in the midst of pain, as you consider your tears, as you consider your wounds, as you think about your losses, there's temptation will set in and tempt you to think, God does not love me. God does not care. And this account rules that argument out of the realm of possibility. Because here on his knees, bleeding tears of blood, already experiencing abandonment from God the Father, already experiencing the isolation, the rejection, the coldness, the scourging, the whips, the forsakenness. Here we see a God who enters into our suffering and does so to the fullest extent possible because he loves you. A God who chooses to suffer in order to rescue his loved ones. A God who chooses pain and grief and sorrow and rejection. A God who suffers alongside us. Look at this cross, our processional cross. So many churches have big, shiny gold ones that are all beautiful. Ours is twisted and warped, because on the cross, Jesus was taking all my sin, and that twists and distorts, because it's not a happy cross. It's a sorrowful cross filled with sin, but also the place in which my salvation was purchased fully, finally, and forever. Here we see a God of love who takes the most intense evil and injustice and cruelty and absorbs it all for our sake and drinks into his soul the just wrath and justice of God as well, doing it for our sake because of our tears and pain and suffering. He sees us and he loves us, and he did it willingly for your sake. Looking at those images of the Nazi Holocaust, the Jewish woman who had lost so much, her family, turned to Lennox and asked, "And what does your religion make of this?" Lennox writes, "What was I to say? She had lost her parents and many relatives in the Holocaust. I could scarcely bear to look at the mingle of photographs because of the sheer horror of imagining my own children suffering such a fate. I had nothing in my life that remotely paralleled the horror that her own family had endured." But she still stood in the doorway, waiting for an answer. I eventually said, "I would not insult your memory of your parents by offering you simplistic answers to your question. What is more, I have young children, and I cannot even bear to think how I might react if anything were to happen to them, even if it were far short of the evil that Mengele did. I have no easy answers, but I do have what, for me at least, is a doorway into an answer." "What is it?" she asked. I said, "You know that I am a Christian, and that means I believe that Yeshua is the Messiah. I also believe that he was God incarnate, come into our world as Savior, which is what the name Yeshua means. Now I know that this is even more difficult for you to accept. Nevertheless, just think about this question. If Yeshua was really God, as I believe he was, what was God doing on a cross? Could it be that God begins here, just here, to meet our heartbreaks by demonstrating that he did not remain distant from our human suffering, but became part of it himself? For me, this is the beginning of hope, and it's a living hope that cannot be smashed by the enemy of death. The story does not end in the darkness of the cross. Yeshua conquered death, I believe. He rose from the dead, and one day, as the final judge, he will assess everything in absolute fairness and righteousness and mercy." There was silence. She was still standing, her arms outstretched, forming a motionless cross in the doorway. And after a moment, with tears in her eyes, very quietly but audibly, she said, "Why has no one ever told me that about my Messiah before?" A God who not only sees the cruelty and the hate in the human heart, he sees the evil in the human story, but he enters into that evil story and becomes its ultimate victim. The ultimate act of injustice for humans to snuff out the very author of life, and for God, and to act as if God's life did not matter. And yet God submitted to it freely and willingly and lovingly because he loves you with a self-sacrificial love, a self-giving love, a love that is costly. Let's pray.